Lindy and Sean and I are alone. Her mother, gone. Our friends, gone. And I look at Lindy, and she looks at me, and there's nothing left for either of us to see. On Wednesday, Dad and Cindy flew to Los Angeles to tape the Alice Pons show. Paul, of course, refused to go. They flew back home on Thursday. The show is being broadcast this afternoon, Monday at 3 p.m. The Alice Pons show is one of the most popular programs in America. Alice appeals to an uneducated, loud audience. Actually, most times I've ever seen it, it seemed pretty ridiculous. Mom, Cindy, and Paul are all in the family room when it's time for the program to start. To the degree my eyes will cooperate, I'll be able to see it too, from my spot by the window. Alice opens her show in her typical style, introducing the day's program in as controversial and outrageous a manner as she can. Parents who kill, she begins, shaking her head sadly. Parents who kill. Why? Her audience instantly boos. What a courageous group, I sarcastically decide. They're against parents who kill their kids. Alice presses on. Today, Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and author Sidney E. McDaniel will be joining us along with his daughter Cynthia McDaniel to discuss Mr. McDaniel's newest work in progress, his book about Earl Detrow, a man who murdered his own child. The audience boos again at the mention of Detrow's name. Alice, smiling inappropriately, says, Parents who can't love their own children, mothers and fathers who slaughter defenseless innocent infants, the Susan Smiths, the Diane Downses, the Earl Detrows of the world. What can these people show us about the nature of pure evil? In today's hour, we'll look at one such monster and see if we can find some answers. I immediately remember the old news stories and TV movies. Susan Smith is that mother who backed her car into a lake in South Carolina, killing her kids and trying to blame it on black abductors. Diane Downs was the woman from Oregon in that old movie Small Sacrifices, who shot her 3 children. And of course, Earl Detrow, homegrown here in Washington State, from the small community of Otis Orchards near Spokane. Earl smothered his 2-year-old retarded son. As Alice Pons carries on, Paul hops up and walks across to the kitchen. He grabs a bag of Ruffles, mesquite barbecue potato chips. Noticing that Mom's attention is glued to the TV screen, Paul pops a tiny piece of chip into my mouth as he walks past. As he does this, he looks at me and smiles, then gives me a little wink. Mom hates him for him to feed me anything without my bib on, because it's a saliva free-flow disaster. But when he sees a chance to do it, Paul often sneaks me treats anyway. I truly love him for it. Unfortunately, just as Dad and Cindy come onto the screen, I begin to feel a seizure start. It's not a real big one, more like a brain sneeze that I can't quite decide whether it's going to happen or not. Still, it's frustrating. Somehow, I manage to keep the bite of potato chip in my mouth. This seizure is not big, but it's big enough for me not to be able to quite make out what Alice Pons is saying on TV, or how Cindy and Paul and Mom are reacting. I'm able to keep my spirit in my body, but for the first 10 minutes of the program, my mouth is blessed by Frito-Lay, while my brain is a short-circuiting wad of useless electrical status. When my seizure finally passes and I'm able to focus again, I realize that Alice has asked Dad a question. In fact, she's still in the middle of that question when Dad cuts her off. You're right, Alice, Dad interrupts in a soft but firm voice. I do love my son, Sean. I love all 3 of my children. I think it's impossible for others to judge whether one person loves another or not. We only know in our own hearts what we feel. Whether people believe I love my son makes little difference to me. I love Sean. I know that Earl Detrow loved his child, Colin, too. For an instant, the audience seems stunned. They don't know whether to applaud or throw hand grenades. As the camera scans their faces, many of them look at Alice for some kind of a hint which way they should go. At first, Alice is not much help. She looks as surprised as they do. Quickly, though, Alice recovers, a serious and heavy shortness to her tone. You think that Earl Dutroux, who murdered little Colin Dutroux, loved his child? You honestly believe that a parent can kill a baby in the name of love? Now the audience knows what to do. They hoot, they howl, they bark like dogs. But before Alice can argue any more with him, Dad begins to speak again. Everybody wants to love their kids, he says, his voice soft, reassuring. Nobody sets out to be a bad parent. Alice's audience begins to quiet down. They're like dumb beasts, hypnotized by the gentle sound of Dad's voice. Yet thousands of children are hurt every year by their parents. Parents who behave as though they hate their kids. The camera pans the audience. Literally dozens of people, tiny heads on tiny bodies, nod in agreement. Dad has them. I really believe that everybody in this room loves their children, and that everybody who is not yet a parent, but will be someday, will love their children too. But has anyone here ever spent months or years of your lives watching your child suffer the most horrifying, excruciating torture imaginable? Have you ever wondered if a definition of love might not include taking responsibility for someone who cannot take responsibility for his or herself? The audience is now dead quiet, staring at Dad and listening. Dad takes a long, slow breath, the first one he's had since he started talking. He looks out into the audience as if quietly daring anyone to contradict him. Dad goes on. We all know, all of us who are parents, that sometimes we hurt our children out of love. We know that telling a child no when that child is desperate to hear yes causes sadness. But when that yes could cause them harm or endanger them, a good parent takes responsibility by saying no, regardless of how upset our child might feel. Alice attempts to interrupt. I think Dad ignores her. The point is that we do have to make hard choices every day to be good parents, to truly take responsibility for our children. If we love them enough, we say no. We let them feel their hurt or sadness or rage, but we stand firm and do what has to be done. The audience begins to applaud in spite of itself. It's as if they can't stop themselves from applauding, from agreeing with something that they don't quite understand, but that makes too much sense to ignore. Alice turns to a woman in the audience to let her ask a question. The woman is short and fat and kind of crazy looking. Don't you think that Dutroux is just a stupid killer? Don't you think that he deserved to be the one to die? Dad stares at the woman and without hesitation responds, Have you ever said to anybody something like, if I'm ever brain damaged and in a coma, just put me out of my misery? What? The woman asks, blinking nervously. Dad presses on. I think most people have said things like that. I know I have. And I know friends have said things like that to me. If you were unable to kill yourself, but you wanted to be dead, don't you think you'd want somebody to know your wishes? Alice, pretending to be real concerned but actually sounding phony to me, says, I'm not sure that's really the point, Sid. We're not here today to discuss voluntary euthanasia. Dad sighs and shakes his head. You're right, Alice. Let's keep that focus nice and tight. To answer your friend's question, what do I think about Dutroux? I think he was a man who did what he thought he had to do. Alice looks at Dad and says, I know you've brought some video footage of interviews you've been conducting with the child killer. Child killer? Dad interrupts. Alice burrows in. Mr. Dutroux did kill his son, didn't he? She asks. He was convicted of murder for that crime, wasn't he? His little boy was a 2-year-old, utterly incapable of defending himself in any way, wasn't he? Alice sounds confident. Suddenly, a photograph of a cute little boy, a blow-up of a snapshot, grainy, a kind of orange tint over the color fills the screen. Alice says, "We're showing our audience a snapshot of little Colin right now." The audience oohs and ahs for a moment, then snaps to silence as they realize this was Earl Detro's victim. Alice, certain that nothing can go wrong, asks, "Earl did kill this little angel, didn't he?" Dad looks at her and quietly says, "No, he didn't." Alice looks genuinely confused, almost stunned. "That is Colin Detro, isn't it?" Dad answers, "Yes, that was him." "Was because his father murdered him?" "No," Dad answers. "Colin died from a terrible, terminal, inoperable seizure disorder, an irreversible medical condition coupled with profound mental retardation that made his existence insufferable. His father," Alice begins, but Dad cuts her off. "His father loved him enough to do whatever he had to do to end his son's suffering. Earl loved his son enough to sacrifice his own life to end his child's pain." "Including murder?" Alice interrupts. "Why don't we let Earl speak for himself?" Dad asks softly. "Indeed," Alice says. "Are we ready to roll the tape?" A couple seconds later, Alice says, "We are? Good. Roll, please." On the screen appears an image of Earl Detro. I have seen him before, but I am curious about his appearance now since he's been in prison. Luckily, my eyes are focused on him. He is sitting in front of a gray wall in an orange-colored inmate's jumpsuit. I can't tell how tall he is, but he looks about the same size as Dad. His face is pleasant. His hair is cut quite short, and he's mostly bald on top. His left ear sticks out a little farther than the right. Otherwise, he's a regular looking, with a mild gap-toothed smile. He sure doesn't look like any murderer I've seen in the movies or on TV crime shows. Just the opposite. He looks like a next-door neighbor. A guy you'd see out mowing his lawn or raking his leaves. Mr. Average. The way the prison room is set up, Dad is sitting next to Earl. Their metal folding chairs almost touch, but both men face more toward the camera than toward one another. They are framed on screen from the ankles up. They look comfortable, if not quite relaxed. "Dad, tell us about life here, Earl." Earl: "Well, it's probably not like you'd expect it to be. Most guys keep pretty much to themselves. If you want to know about bad stuff, you can find out about it. If you want to stay out of people's way and just mind your own business, you can do that. That's been my approach so far. It's sort of like scout camp, only there's a lot more tattoos." Dad smiles, then pauses and grows serious. "We came to talk about your son, Earl, about Colin and what happened to him. Are you ready to discuss that?" Earl swallows hard and stares down at his hands crossed in his lap. "It's hard, but yeah, I'm ready." Dad: "Why did you kill him, Earl?" Earl: "Nobody will ever understand this. I'm not saying it to be understood. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you have a son like Colin. Maybe it'll help you and other people with children like Colin. I don't feel now, and I will never feel, that I killed or murdered Colin. I did what I did with my son to end his suffering." Earl pauses a moment and takes several slow, deep breaths. He looks up at Dad. The camera slowly closes in on his face. "If you love your child enough and you see him suffering horribly, and you know both medically, because of what the docs tell you, and in your heart that his condition is hopeless, and that his life is nothing but pain and agony, if you love him enough, what do? Colin was helpless. It was like he was in the hands of invisible demons whose only reason for existence was to torture him." A tear slowly slips out of the corner of Earl Detro's left eye. He wipes it off his cheek with the back of his right hand. "It had to stop. I didn't care about what the laws or the cops or anybody else had to say about it. Hell, they didn't know. They weren't there watching Colin. They weren't in his head or in my heart. I didn't care about what could happen to me. It had to stop. I loved Colin. I still love him, and I'll always love him. Ending his suffering was all I cared about. I did that, and whatever anybody else thinks of me, I feel that what I did is between me and Colin and his mother and our God. Dad, if you had it to do over again, would you do it? Earl smiles a little. I guess I'm supposed to say, no, sir, I've learned my lesson. I mean, I would like to get out of this place someday, so I'm supposed to say that I know what I did was wrong. But the truth is, I'd do it again this second. I'd do it every day they let me out if I saw Colin suffering. Yeah, I'd do it again. Dad, what if next week they invented a new medication or a new procedure that could have cured Colin? How could you live with yourself if that happened? Earl, well, the doc said it wasn't going to happen, but if it did, how would I feel? How will I feel if, at the end of my life, I'm cast down into hell for all eternity for what I did? Earl smiles sadly and looks away from the camera. He pauses and then takes a sip from a glass of water on a table off camera, then sets the glass back down. He takes a deep breath. You know, when I did it, I put the pillow over Colin's face and held it there. Not hard so as to hurt him, but just enough to cut off the air. I held the pillow, and I prayed as hard as I could. I hoped God might intervene, like he did with Abraham, when he provided a ram and spared Isaac. Only, I wasn't praying for God to stop me. I was praying that Colin wasn't suffering. He didn't struggle against me at all. He was real still and quiet the whole time. Earl pauses again and breathes slowly, steadying himself. I prayed for God to let Colin's suffering end and to take care of him for me. When it was over, when I felt Colin go, he lay there like an angel, so beautiful, and I could tell that for the first time in his life, I knew in my heart that for the first time in his life he was without pain. I looked into his eyes and saw that he was gone. For the first time ever, I saw peace in his face. Earl looks up and tears stream down both his cheeks. He has finished talking. His face, although tear-streaked, looks calm and peaceful. He sits straight with dignity and quiet pride. Dad, thank you for talking to us, Earl. That's enough for today. The camera clicks off and the screen goes blank. We are suddenly back to Alice Pons, who stands quietly for a moment, then speaks her voice full of emotion. We'll be right back. Our family room is utterly silent. I can hear Mom breathing. I see Paul and Cindy speechless, staring vacantly at the TV as a lady on the screen talks about the bright whiteness of her wash. No one looks at me. I think about Earl and Colin, about Dad and me. What good is love if it isn't about putting somebody else ahead of yourself? I don't think Earl was playing God when he killed Colin. He believed that loving his son meant ending the kid's suffering by any means necessary. Earl's action and Dad's decision to study it convinced me more than ever that Dad is still working out what he should do with me. Dad knows that Earl loved his son, just like Dad loves me. I have this feeling, a gut feeling, so real that I can't deny it, that right now, Dad is trying to find a reason, any reason, not to kill me. But before Alice Pons and her astonished audience and my dad and my sister and another commercial and all the rest can come back, the seizure I fought off a little while ago charges back into my head. There's no stopping it this time as it begins its march up my spine, down my arms, and across my forehead. Crackle, crackle, crackle. That's all the Alice Pons I'm going to get today.